Hi folks, welcome to this video on developing and improving flexibility, and more specifically the various training methods we can use in order to develop and improve flexibility. Sometimes they might use the word mobility instead as flexibility, so if I do use that, it's exactly the same thing. Now, the exam board identifies 5 different types of stretching flexibility training they want you to know about. Static stretching, Proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, bit of a mouthful, also known as PNF, isometric stretching, ballistic stretching, and dynamic stretching. So we're going to do each of these at a time. You could get short answer questions on one of these. They could say, describe one method of improving flexibility, or you could get a big question on flexibility training and you need to answer about all of them. So just keep that in your mind. I'd advise you need to be able to say about 3 or 4 things on each of these methods of developing flexibility. So the first one we'll look at is static stretching. Now, this is one that I think we're all very, very familiar with, holding stretches in fixed position. So static as in remaining still. So you stretch and hold at your end of range of movement for 10 to 30 seconds. Remember, this isn't a warm-up. We're not warming up here. We are training to improve flexibility. So in a warm-up, you might hold no longer than 10 seconds. And actually, to be honest, static stretching is a very poor choice of stretch to do as part of a warm-up anyway, so you certainly shouldn't do static stretching as part of a warm-up. So we're doing static stretching, holding for 10 to 30 seconds, and you're aiming to repeat each stretch between 3 and 6 times. It is safe and effective because you're getting to end of range and holding it still, you're not pushing it any further. It's probably better suited to maintaining flexibility as opposed to improving flexibility, so maybe that's a potential downside to it. It's much better to use in a cool down. The reason I said it's not good to use in a warm up, there are many reasons, but one of the obvious ones is you've spent all that time trying to get your body warm, elevating your heart rate, elevating the blood flow around the body and the oxygen delivery. Then you stand still for 5 minutes and do static stretching, and all those things drop again. You want to keep moving when you're doing static stretching. When you're doing stretching as part of a warm up, and static stretching is not, moving stretching; it's keeping still. But obviously, in a cool down, when you're trying to retain your heart rate, your blood pressure down to resting levels, it's better suited to that. So like we've covered that as well, and it doesn't cover very rare that you do a sport where you hold a fixed position for longer than 10 seconds. So static stretching isn't very sport specific either. Now, within static stretching, as we covered in the video on the different types of stretching, you've got 2 variations. You've got active stretching and you've got passive stretching. So active stretching is where you move yourself into position, you contract an agonist to stretch the antagonist, and you hold it for longer than 10 seconds. So here's your classic gastrocnemius stretching the gastrocnemius there. But what we're doing is you're contracting your tibialis anterior on the front of your shin to pull your toes towards your shin. That's allowing you to drop your heel into the ground, and so you are stretching the antagonist, the gastrocnemius, in this situation. So you're contracting one muscle group at the front of the shin to stretch the muscle on the back of the shin, on the back of the tibia, Whereas passive stretching, use of a partner or equipment, get you to end of range and hold it still there for 10 to 30 seconds. So this lady here has pulled this lady's arms back. This is stretching the pecs, the anterior deltoids, things like that. And she's going to hold that position there for 10 to 30 seconds. Now, this method here, you might have done before, you might never have even heard of before. Isometric stretching. Think back to when you did types of contractions. An isometric contraction is where you contracted a muscle, but you didn't change length. You just held it in a fixed position. So, when you're looking at movement analysis, classic question, the crucifix in gymnastics, where the guys hold the crucifix position on the rings, they're isometric contractions. They're trying to hold a fixed position. But we can actually use an isometric contraction to improve flexibility, and we call that isometric stretching. So it can be done on your own, i.e. actively, or it can be done with a partner or with equipment passively, very similar to static stretching, as we've just said there. What you do is you move into a static stretch. So let's take this here. She's doing the classic, wall calf stretch. So she's stretching the calf, the gastrocnemius, on the back leg there. When she's in that position there, what she's then going to do is she's going to isometrically contract that gastrocnemius for anywhere between 7 and 20 seconds. Why 7? I have no idea. It's just one of those stats that's given out. But I think you'd get away with saying 10 to 20 seconds in the exam. So 10 to 20 seconds, you isometrically contract that gastrocnemius whilst it's on full stretch. What you then do is you then stop the contraction, stay, and you'll obviously still be in that same position because it's an isometric contraction, and then you just continue the stretch and relax it for another 20 seconds. Now, you've probably heard me refer to this thing a few times, this stretch reflex. Just to remind you of what that is, when you stretch a muscle, you have something inside that muscle called a muscle spindle. And the job of the muscle spindle is to detect stretch and prevent overstretch, prevent the muscle getting too long. And we call that the stretch reflex. So you might have experienced it before when someone's been stretching you and you get to end of range and you get a bit of a wobble going, a bit of a shake. That's the stretch reflex. The muscle's trying to push back as if to say, don't push me too much further because I might injure myself. Well, what we can do is this isometric stretching allows us to overcome that stretch reflex a little bit, so we can just push a little bit deeper into the stretch, not dangerously deep into the stretch, so we're going to increase the risk of tearing, just a little bit deeper so we get that little bit greater range of movement. It also helps increase the strength in the tense muscle. So, it's isometric stretching. You are combining strength training with flexibility training. So we can improve flexibility. We can also improve the strength in it as well. However, as a result of that, it carries a higher injury risk. And generally, as a rule, it should be carried out by anyone under the age of 16, just because they're not coordinated enough to produce the movement effectively. And it should be limited to once every 36 hours. This kind of flexibility training shouldn't be repeated every day. In other words, leave it a day and a half, a couple of days in between before you do it again, because obviously you are pushing that muscle, you are overriding that stretch reflex. So you are potentially increasing the risk of injury because you can now push deeper into the stretch. It shouldn't be repeated any more frequently than that. Now this one you've been dreading, big weird words, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, abbreviated to PNF stretching. Now this is a PNF stretch here, so it comes in 3 stages. Now we'll deal with the stages first. What you do is, you do a static passive stretch for up to 30 seconds. So this person here is pushing this lady's leg to end of range and he is holding it still, so static, but he's stretching her, so it's passive, and he's holding it at end of range of movement for 30 seconds. As you can see, he's now leaning in to it, because what he's doing is, or what she's doing is, she's now pushing back against him, doing a 10-second isometric contraction. So isometric, that leg isn't moving, but she's pushing back at him, he's pushing against her, and the leg should stay in the same stretch position. What you then do is you then repeat the stretch again, a static passive stretch. But as you can see, look at the angle there from that picture to that picture. There it was pretty much near enough 90 degrees. Now we can see it's gone greater than 90 degrees. So there has been a big increase in range of movement from there to there by doing this 10-second isometric contraction in between. Right, so why is that happening? Well, again, it's our old friend, the stretch reflex. What we're doing by doing this 10-second isometric contraction, that when you're doing this stretch here, the stretch reflex is active. You'll get that lady, you'll probably be experiencing a little bit of trembling in that hamstring, twitching back against the guy applying resistance because she's pretty much close to end of range. By doing that 10-second isometric contraction, just as you did with the isometric stretching on the previous slide, that delays the stretch reflex. So the guy can then push the stretch greater because there's less inhibition, there's less fight back from the leg, so he can achieve, or she can achieve, a greater range of movement. So it leads to an increase in muscle length again. Just to clarify the stretch reflex, remember, reflex is an automatic response. Should you send a muscle to end of range, you stretch it, you'll automatically get a reflex to push back. So what you're doing there, as he's pushed there to end of range, there'll be a natural reflex to push back against him. By doing an isometric contraction, you delay that stretch reflex so you can push into a greater range of movement. This type of stretching shows the greatest gains in flexibility by far. You see much improved flexibility quite rapidly, and it's very good to use as part of the cool down, at the end of a session. And it's very good for developing flexibility around joints with a limited flexibility. They might be that they're carrying an injury, or they've naturally always been tight around that particular muscle group. It's a very good method for doing that. But the downside is it's for the most complex method, it's the most time consuming, you'll need a partner to help you, and it's the most uncomfortable. You're not in control of that stretch. That's quite painful to do anyway, that 10-second isometric contraction. It's not the most pleasant stretch to do. Right, so penultimately then, we've got ballistic stretching, and it's swinging or bouncing movements. You might be thinking, I thought that was dynamic stretching. They're very similar. There's a slight difference. We're going to go into that, and we're doing dynamic stretching to finish off with next. So swinging or bouncing movements, this is ballistic stretching. What this lady's doing here, swinging that leg up to her hand, uses momentum to move the joint. So she swings her leg back, the leg develops momentum, which means she can swing it through at a fast pace. A bouncing action or a spring kind of action. So, the leg is swinging forward, springing forward. And it's very specific to those performers who are doing sport associated with ballistic movements, so gymnastics, martial arts. So you'll see a lot of those kind of performers doing a lot of ballistic stretching. The good thing about it as well is it develops speed and power as well as improving flexibility, because you're doing lots of fast dynamic stretching movements. But obviously, as a result of that, it carries the highest injury risk. Why? Well, your muscle hasn't got sufficient enough time to lengthen properly. You're swinging it through, swinging it back, swinging it through, swinging it back. So you get it to end of range and then get it to stop and pull back very quickly. So it does carry an increased injury risk. And it may actually activate the stretch reflex. It may, those other methods that we've looked at so far have delayed the stretch reflex. This may actually activate it and bring it in. So there's some question marks as to how effective it is, hence why it's generally only really done by these performers, because they naturally do explosive dynamic flexibility movements in their events, so it's very specific to them. So that's ballistic stretching. Now let's look at the difference between that and dynamic stretching. So dynamic stretching then, it is things like arm circles, lunges, squats. So we are moving like we're in ballistic stretching, but the reality on this one is we take the joint through a full range of movement with control over entry and exit of stretch. It's a lot slower, and we can get to end of range and push it through and get a full range of movement and keep moving all the time, but we're not swinging or bouncing or springing. If anything, it's very much like ballistic stretching, but more slower and more controlled. We control the entry and the exit of the stretch. So I put that as more controlled than ballistic stretching. It does not go to extreme endpoint and swing it straight back. As a result of that, we've got less risk of injury whilst we're doing dynamic stretching. These are the best stretches to do as part of a warm-up because they can recreate sporting actions. Lunges, squats, arm circles. How many times do you pick yourself up off the floor when you're playing your sport, or you've got to crouch onto a low position and jump up, or for a header or a catch? You are recreating these movements. Use arm circles to grab things, throw things, pass things, whatever it is. So they're very, very sport specific, and that's why they're often done as part of a warm-up. Don't forget as well, the dynamic, the moving, so you'll also keep your heart rate elevated, which again is why they're great for a warm-up. And, in terms of time, you should be looking at doing reps on these stretches, 8 to 12 reps. That'll take you about 10, 15, 20 seconds to do all that. So you often do reps on these kind of stretches to make sure you do the same number on each limb. So there are all the different types of methods of developing flexibility. And like I said, you might get short answer questions on each one, or you might get a big answer question asking about them all. So you need to make sure you can say 3 or 4 things on each of these stretches. Hope you found this video useful, folks.